Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. I've set out to uncover amazing and insightful stories, and I'm going to do that by interviewing people from all different backgrounds and perspectives. And I know there are a ton of other interview shows out there, no doubt, but only this show aims to also teach you what it means to listen more than you speak so that you can become a more thoughtful and informed person. I'm a former journalist, and I believe everyone has a story to tell. There's always a story there. But we only discover those stories when we ask questions and then sit back and listen. Because the more questions you're asking, the more you're listening. And the more you're listening, the more you realize our stories are really similar if you get down to it. My goal is to get beneath cliche answers that you hear on so many different shows and reveal real nuggets of experiences, desires, truths, dreams, and thoughts that make every person who they truly are. This week on the show, I welcome Jen Poyant. Jen, she's been in journalism. She's been in the podcast producing space. She's been in public radio. She's done a lot behind the scenes to tell stories. Right now, she's the executive producer of 10% Happier's podcast, which 10% Happier is a meditation guidance app. But she's also founded her own production company in the past. We talk about that. She's been the producer and worked on different podcasts, very popular podcasts like Note to Self and Two Dope Queens. And today on the show, you might be wondering why a podcast producer? Why somebody who works behind the scenes? Why somebody who, really isn't front and center in telling these stories? Why not get the host of these shows? Well, because so much of the work that goes on behind the scenes can be relevant in us telling our stories. And you'll hear from Jen how experimenting with your craft and your passion to find what works, what resonates, can help you actually then, if you apply those to your own life, tell your own story better. And that's something that I believe is desperately, desperately missing from our conversations. The ability to tell our stories, to delight, to inform in a way that doesn't speak over someone, but resonates with them and gets down to the heart of the matter. Whose story is it? Whose story do you want to portray? I think if it's ours, it's every bit as important as an executive producer on a podcast telling someone else's story. So listen to this conversation with Jen with that frame of reference in mind. Enjoy it. In doing some research and background on just you and digging around LinkedIn and whatnot, you've had a lot of different positions over the course of your career. And I would love to just hear from you, like, how do you explain in just a few sentences, the path and the way that your career has progressed?
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that. I think the way I usually start off with people is to give kind of a broad swath of saying, like, I'm a public radio veteran, is one way of putting it. I started out, I also didn't get into radio until I was in my mid-20s. So I felt like I was a bit of a late bloomer. I kind of was one of those people that begged and begged and begged for an internship at a local public radio station in Virginia. And eventually the news director there relented. And then I just worked my way up he introduced me to the news director at WBGO in Newark, and I worked there as a reporter, WHYY as a reporter, and then eventually decided public radio reporting is not the most lucrative career. And this was before podcasting. And I really wanted a little bit more security. So I ended up working my way into an internship at WNYC and worked my way up from associate producer to executive producer there over a number of years and a number of different shows, some daily news shows, eventually into podcasting and more narrative long form work.
As a former...
And then, of course, I didn't even get into the Stable Genius side of things, but eventually I left, started my own business with my kind of creative partner from WNYC, Manoush Samarodi, and we started our own production company. And I'm sure we'll get into all of that as well. But all of those opportunities kind of led me to have a lot of time experimenting both with audio and with journalism. And now I am the executive producer at 10% Happier, experimenting with mindfulness and meditation content that's all kind of based around what we like to call relatable wisdom. So I've been very lucky. It's been, some of it's really good timing and a lot of hard work, but lots of fun along the way, lots of different opportunities to kind of like play, basically, in a really cool sandbox.
Yeah. You mentioned you were begging for that internship. Why? Mm-hmm. What was the drive there?
Yeah. So I mentioned that I hadn't really had a professional career or direction in my early 20s. I had kind of a personal tragedy early. My oldest brother had passed away and when I was in my early 20s. And I just didn't know what to do with myself. Like I had gone to graduate school and done kind of like a very philosophical cultural studies program in London and worked in Japan for a while teaching English. But after he passed away, I was a little, forlorn and mourning and grieving and waiting tables in the same small town where I had gone done my undergraduate. And then eventually I realized when I was in Japan that I kept listening to the reports of Hurricane Katrina. I would get home from work and I was homesick because I was in Japan and didn't have many people to talk to. So listening to the radio felt comforting for me. And I realized I could do that. I could tell those stories that are being told during this like really tragic time. So once I'd gotten back from Japan, that was what I decided to do. Was finally I felt like I had a direction, and but there were no jobs in that tiny little station, and it was WVTF right in Roanoke. So I would drive, half an hour from Blacksburg over to Roanoke, and eventually he said, "Okay, stop begging." But it's funny, I was a terrible broadcast writer. I had no idea what I was doing because I'd come from graduate school where you write these long philosophical discursive essays, and that is the opposite of what you do in broadcast writing. So there was a lot of red ink and a lot of kind of humbling learning going on during that phase of my career.
You mentioned you're listening to those reports on Katrina and thinking, I could tell those stories. Why did that appeal to you? What was the appeal of wanting to tell those stories and actually be a part of that process?
Yeah, well, I had been an English major and art history major in college, and had always thought that I would do something related to languages or storytelling or something. I just couldn't quite put my finger on it. And also back then the job market was so competitive particularly for journalism jobs. It still is. It's not an easy career to get into. Now, podcasting is a lot easier than it used to be, obviously, because there was nothing called podcasting back then. But I think for me, it was just it was hearing stories that I could relate to and hearing stories that had meaning and knowing that there was a way for me to access that skill set. I just knew that I would be able to do it. And that was like a big deal for me because I was not a student that, my parents were kind of like, do what you want to do. They didn't push us in a way, my brothers and I, to go in a certain direction. They wanted us to figure it out. And eventually I did.
What did you end up learning, or what was the experience in going from art and literature and that long form style of writing to, as you just mentioned, broadcast and trying to tell a story when you may have 2 minutes of time? How did you experience that?
It's funny. So looking back on it now, I had these, the first couple of stations I worked at, I had great mentors. They were both news direct, kind of old school radio style news directors, and both older than me. I was in my mid 20s at the time. So they were probably in their mid 40s, but which I'm in my 40s now. So it's funny. It's I think back on it and I think they felt older in quotes, but they were pretty not harsh, but there was a lot of red ink on those drafts. And I think what they were trying to do was just teach me to show up and do it better every time. And really just there are some, classic tenets of broadcast writing, and it's really like write it the way you say it, write in a way that people can relate to the ear. And so it's a lot, the sentences are shorter, they're more colloquial, little things too. I remember at the second station I started working at, WBGO, one of the anchors there noted aptly that I was starting off these small, short news packages every time with like, Governor Corzine says, and he's like, stop saying Governor Corzine says, like start off with some little detail of, the press conference that you found fascinating. So just learning those tricks of the trade to like catch the person's ear, especially because radio, if you lose their interest, that's it. They're going to change the channel, or they've missed the key point that you've worked all day for your 2 minutes on the radio to get, so you have to learn to get people's attention and be snappy and be smart about it. And it took some time. It was not a natural skill set for me.
Now that you are, as you said, producing podcasts for 10% Happier, which is a software company or meditation software, correct? Do I have that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's like a meditate. We teach people how to meditate and learn mindfulness through an app.
Yeah, I thought that was it. Do you still consider yourself a journalist? Do you still consider yourself that being a part of you?
That's a great question. And I struggled with this at Stable Genius as well. I do. I do in the sense that it's really hard to take that out of the equation once you've worked in a career for 20 years. Meaning that I approach everything I do with journalistic ethics, and I approach storytelling in a way that's very much combined with my journalistic experience, particularly in public radio. Is everybody that I work with a journalist? No. Is that the first thing that I would describe myself at 10%? No, but it's not, I can't separate it out. I'm first and foremost now a podcast producer, but yeah, there's some journalism that sprinkled in there too, I guess.
What has it been like then to see over the course of your career, the rise in podcasting? It has, obviously it's huge, and we're talking on a podcast right now, and you're a podcast producer. Like, what has that transition been like for you coming from radio to podcasting?
It's been really fascinating. I think part of it actually has to do, the most interesting thing has to do with the fact that when I started in public radio, particularly when I finally got that first kind of part-time gig at WNYC, the job market in New York City, for example, for people that wanted to get into audio, public radio would be, audio storytelling. It was tiny. Like there were the folks up at This American Life, and I'm sure that team was, I don't know, maybe 8 people at the time. And there was an NPR bureau in the city. There was Fordham University, which I applied for an assistant news director job there and didn't get. There was StoryCorps. I applied for an associate producer job there, didn't get it. And then there was WNYC. And so for the entire city of New York, there might have been, 100 jobs, full-time jobs at the time. And so once I finally did get that job, and I worked really hard to get it, years of per diem work and internships and all that, and some of them unpaid and with no real financial support from anybody else. So it was not an easy process, but once I did get it, there was a tremendous amount of accomplishment for even just getting the job. And I will say, like, once podcasting exploded, the job market just naturally did too. And so I was watching people that just had the best sense of the best timing, right? Like they didn't have to, and I don't just mean my own struggle. I mean, everybody in radio at that time was like busting their butts to like secure that gig. And then there was a moment where it was open. It was more open and free, and people could experiment, and people could go off and make their own shows, and people could make opportunities for themselves. And so it just exploded into this like both sense of creative freedom, a lot of power for workers, which is great. And then it created opportunities for us all to grow as well. Like when I started out, I was doing daily news magazines, basically. So I was working at WNYC at The Takeaway as a news producer, and then eventually at the Brian Lehrer Show for a little while, covering for their executive producer while she was on maternity leave. And then once podcasting started to explode, it was like, oh, I can go off. I don't have to be in the day-to-day news cycle. I can go off and tell these stories that are a little bit more long form, play around, see if we can experiment with the storytelling, see if we can experiment with audio engagement. And a lot of that opportunity wouldn't have come without the explosion of podcasting. Which on the media, Radio Lab, Freakonomics, a lot of people at WNYC were really on the forefront of experimenting with the medium and really showing us all the way. So it was very exciting. And it was also very, it was just wild to watch it happen because the job market flipped within a couple of years.
Jen, what did you mean by, there was this moment where it was free and the ideas were more free flowing, I think is kind of the phrase that you used. Similar. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. So once I left Daily News, I joined Manoush over at Note to Self. But back then it had been a show called New Tech City. And she had come from a broadcast news background, BBC, breaking news. And she was still trying to kind of experiment with what the format was going to be. They just rebranded it Note to Self. And just for your listeners, so Note to Self was a journalism podcast, tech journalism. And Manoush was just dogged about really looking into the way technology affected our brains, our bodies, our democracy, our relationships, all of it. And, when I joined that show, I think she and I talked about this. It's not something that she hasn't said herself. I think she was used to the broadcast medium, like newsy kind of reportorial approach. And I said to her, you don't have to do that. Like, be yourself. You're so cool. Like, she was so funny. And everybody, it's a cliche now, but back then it was a big deal to recognize that podcasting was more intimate, right? You're in each other's ears with the earplug, like the headphones and the earpods. And it feels like the person is talking directly to you. It's different than the feel of broadcast. And so her voice blossomed. She really kind of came into her own version of storytelling. And then we also just started experimenting with these challenges, for example. Now challenges are everywhere, right? We're doing one at 10% right now. But this was kind of new back then. And the idea was to try to get people to experiment with putting their phone away, or just think about the impact that the iPhone had, or whatever smartphone they had on their everyday lives, right? And that sort of stuff, it's not as easy to do in a broadcast space where you may be you're just kind of catching whoever is listening at the time for whatever reason, whether it's drive time or live. Live is exciting because it's live and that's it. And then you turn it off and it's gone. But podcasting allowed this opportunity to really engage listeners, to create a loyal audience, to play with storytelling, to play with this engagement, to play with our voices and how we want it to even sound. And so it's more freeing in that sense. The format just allowed a lot more experimentation, I think.
That brings up another question then. You've seen both sides, I guess, to put it that way. Do you feel that too many podcasts try to approach their shows with the news radio mindset or the, morning drive mindset and not the storytelling aspect that you just described? Do you feel that's a thing? A little bit of a leading question.
I feel like it's a great service. And if you're willing to do that, good on you. I think it's always really hard to do. It's harder. They're both hard. They're hard in different ways. It depends on how frequently you're publishing. If you're doing a daily news show on a podcast, good Lord, that's a lot of work. But then the storytelling is just different, right? You have to figure out your cadence of how often you're publishing, the types of stories. You can do storytelling in a two-way situation like the conversation you and I are having here, there's great stories to be told that way. And then there's also like more, deeper narrative construction with scoring, et cetera, or somewhere in between. And that's something that like I'm always really excited to explore. But no, I think it's kind of cool. Like podcasting, I would say to each his own. For like, if you're making your own show, you do whatever you want. And if it works, you're going to get some listenership. And, if it doesn't, then experiment and play. But no, I don't know. I think it all is in service of providing some sort of either entertainment or information or education or connection for people in whatever way you think you can do it as a host or a producer. Go for it. Try it.
How do you approach storytelling? You've mentioned it several times here. That's
a big question.
Yeah,
I don't know. Let me think about that. What were you going to say? What was your follow-up for that one?
I was just going to say, you've mentioned storytelling several times here. I'd love to dive into your brain. Like, what is your process to tell a story?
Yeah. I think, first of all, for me, the process starts with whose story it is that we're diving into, right? Who's your host? And is it a host-driven story, meaning that host wants to go out and find a story and then tell it, or is it are we going to a person because we know that person's got a story to tell? And that sounds like a small distinction, but it can really matter in how we approach what we're doing and what we're trying to accomplish in a story. But I think it all depends. It depends on what kind of tape you have. If you have tape. It depends on, again, your cadence and the format of your show. So I tend to, on a two-way show, that has more to do with like the prep that you have beforehand for an interview, of knowing that there's some sort of either biographical arc you're going for or some event that you really want to dive into, and you're prepped with all the details to get to that one thing. But if it's more of a documentary style, then it's about, taking a step back, looking at your tape, figuring out your script, writing drafts after draft, and then kind of slowly coordinating your tape into your script. It just depends. It depends on the format, I think.
How did you know you wanted to be on the production and the producing side of not only radio and writing broadcast scripts, but now, with 10% Happier being the executive producer of those shows, how did you know that was the path for you?
That's a great question, because I think there are a lot of people that tend to say I want to be a host, or know they want to be a reporter / host, that sort of thing. I've done hosting, but it's not something that's like the first thing for me to go for. I think it's because I'm a good producer. Like, I know I'm good at it. And you always want to kind of grow and learn. It's not that I'm not a great host or anything, but it's just, there's something about understanding how to work with talent, meaning hosts and other producers, to pull things together, how to identify story ideas, how to identify someone that's going to be a great host is a skill that a lot of people don't have. There's a little bit of magic in there of seeing when something's going to work. I love working with audio engineers, especially like the engineer I work with now is kind of like a creative partner. He and I can kind of read each other's minds of when something isn't working or when it is. So I don't know, maybe it's the collaborative aspect of it, or maybe it's just that it's kind of what I've always done and it's worked and it's fun. So I think people don't understand what a producer does a lot of the time, but it's kind of like a cool magical position in the sense that it feels sometimes like you're waving a magic wand to pull it all together and make it work, and that's fun. That's fun to be able to pull something like that off, whether it's live radio or producing a podcast, to know you're kind of supporting everything to make it work and work well and sing. And that's exciting to make that happen over and over again.
Is there a story then that comes to mind where you point to those moments of magic or storytelling where you say, it was at this moment that I knew we had it? Is there anything that comes to mind there?
Yeah. there were a lot of moments on Note to Self with Manoush like that, where she would come to me with an idea, and for example, we did these, like I mentioned before, we did these challenges. So she did the Bored and Brilliant challenge before I had come on, and then we did two other ones, one on information overload called Infomagical, and another one on privacy and data, like what happens to your data on the internet, which like now everyone knows, but back then they didn't.
Yeah.
And so both of those were like experiments to like get people to kind of interface with us and engage with us back and forth on these two ideas. And both of those projects took probably 6 months of full-time planning to pull off. And we ended up getting at the time, I think around 50,000 people during the same week to experiment with us. But she interviewed for all of those projects, she would interview neuroscientists and, psychologists and all sorts of like journalists and thinkers for these different pieces for each episode. And then we would score them beautifully and edit them down. And they were like, we would all be sitting in the editing room, as we were working on these projects together. And there was always a moment at the end of those edit rooms, which we can't do now. We can't sit in edit rooms together, which is super depressing. But where we would just look at each other, particularly at the end of that Infomagical project, which is just countless hours of work went into that project, where we would be like, that's it. That's it. It sounds great. Like, this is what it should sound like. And there's a moment of joyousness involved in that, if you're doing it right with your team, like you achieve that on a regular basis. And it's almost like it's like a little natural high you get together. Super exciting.
50,000, you had 50,000 people participate. Like, can you explain that a little bit more? What was the challenge?
Yep. So for Infomagical, we ended up setting up like kind of like a website, and we would each like box on this website, on this landing page, had a different challenge for each day, right? And you would go and I think that one we had signed up. We had people sign up through a text message bot. Like we could set up a bot.
Okay, yeah.
And you could call in, and Manoush would be like, "Did you do your challenge today?" And if you said yes, you could hit 1, and then it would essentially like send you a text to encourage you on how it went. And 50,000 people did it in the same week. So each day there was a new challenge for like stay off Twitter today, delete an app, those sorts of things. Just to get people to understand, like single tasking, all sorts of things like that. And yeah, it was just a way to get people to kind of like organize their minds in a way that they hadn't, because of all the information that was coming at us every day. And so same thing, we're actually doing a similar challenge, and 10%'s been doing them even since before I've joined, but 130,000 people are doing this challenge that we're doing at 10% right now. And it's basically on New Year's, and it's centered around the concept of self-acceptance and self-compassion. And so each day there's a prompt on the app to ask you to meditate with us. And there's a little bit of a talk on some version of what self-compassion even is, or what is self-love, particularly in the context of such a like hard and arduous time that we're all in. And then people all over the world, 130,000 people are meditating every single day around the same time, or at least within the same day together through the app. So it's a similar idea. It's like getting a prompt, changing your behavior a little bit, learning something, and then moving forward all together in a community.
What was the storyline thread with Infomagical that you came across as you built that challenge and that I want to say episode. I don't know if that's the right word to say, but as you were working through that Infomagical project, and you've talked a lot about stories, what were the stories that came out of that? What did you land on there?
I think I hate to say this, but I would actually have to go back and look because it was a while ago. So I honestly don't remember the individual stories that we did. I could go back if you want me to find it.
Oh,
but,
it's fine.
I don't remember.
It's fine. I'll phrase it this way then, perhaps. As an executive producer and in the role that you are in, what makes a good story? What catches your eye?
That's a good question. I mean, I think for me, there has to be a detail of some sort of either emotional resonance or some sort of aha moment, some moment where people learn something new or figure out something about themselves through listening. So relatability, that's super important, I think, in a good story. And then the telling of it, as you're asking, is about how you unfold it. So there's always a little bit of element of surprise while you're still kind of avoiding cliche, which is tricky. So I don't know. I tend to like to start stories, at least on my longer form narrative podcasts, with a really solid piece of tape at the top, often what we call a cold open. And then an intro, and I'm pretty traditional in this way. Like my intros into a podcast that's about to tell a story, I like to kind of walk the line of what we call billboarding, or informing the listener a little bit about where we're going, and then really diving into the depths of whatever that person's story is, or whatever the storyline is. And then just getting into the details. The details have to be surprising. They have to be interesting. They have to be, they have to take you in places that you didn't expect. And of course, you have to try to get, find some delight in there too. So there's a high bar to tell a really good story. I think there's got to be a lot of elements that kind of come together. And I think also pacing is really important. I am a real stickler about listening to a story that's like paced incorrectly. Basically, if it's too fast or if it's too slow, I lose interest or I get annoyed. If it's too fast, I get annoyed. If it's too slow, I lose interest. So I'll work with our audio editors to either like add a breath, add some space here, add a pregnant pause here, let it sink in, especially if there's a joke. Often I'll see editors that there'll be a really funny joke, and then immediately there's like a sentence right after, and I'm like, no, give that some space so people actually have time to laugh and think about why that was funny, and then move forward. So pacing helps too.
The delight, I'm interested in that. What you just said. As a journalist, I don't know that was ever in my vernacular, to delight the reader as I was writing a story. Was that a learned thing through podcasting, or did you always approach your career, your work with that intention to delight?
Well, I will give a caveat. I'm not an investigative journalist too. So if you're an investigative journalist, generally you're probably like, don't care about providing delight at all.
I was a sports writer, so I can't claim to be an investigative journalist either.
but no, that's a good question too. I don't know. I think that it's part of the emotional resonance, right? Like either you're trying to get people to relate to you on some fundamental, truth of some sort, or you're trying to get them to relate in a way that's like fun. And podcasting can be really fun. Like you have all these tools, like sound design and music, and even if it's a sad story, there are times where there's like even of course room for a little bit of comic relief or moments of levity. And I don't know. I tend to try if we can to like sprinkle in something that's funny or fun into a story to get people to like lighten up. Life's hard. I mean, it's so hard, especially these days. Oh, it's so hard. So I think maybe it's a way of staying connected with the listener.
Dive into Stable Genius Productions. What was the birth story there? And you mentioned it was with a colleague that you had previously worked with. Mm-hmm. Why the want to start a production company?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we, Manoush Marodi and I had been working together on Note to Self at WNYC I had also gone off and developed a couple of other shows at WNYC. So I was at this point in my career, which was super exciting as an executive producer, where I had like a lot of opportunity to make a bunch of really different stuff. Some of the other like one of the other shows wasn't even journalistic. It was comedy, which was fun. But Manoush and I, we were finding success with Note to Self. And like I said, we were doing those engagement projects that, asked people to kind of change their behavior. That was working. People were really excited about seeing how that how that worked within a podcast and how we could kind of play around with different formats of audio, etc. And on top of that, she had done a TED Talk and written a book off of the first project. And so we were excited about the potential of maybe, repeating that formula as a way to grow the brand Note to Self. And so we pitched that idea to WNYC, the folks at WNYC. And then on top of that, Me Too had really exploded at the company. And I had worked on a show that had been very much embroiled in the Me Too, actually a couple of shows that have been embroiled in the Me Too drama, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word.
Yeah.
But, and between those two things, like WNYC just could not provide, and even if they had wanted to, provided the resources at the time for us to grow the way that we were looking to grow as kind of like a bigger platform and a bigger brand. And we were like, maybe we should just try and do it on our own. People are doing this, and we're two strong women. And we had actually done some reporting at Note to Self on another two women that had gone off, and they're middle-aged women starting their own company. And we had covered that and thought, how funny, like, why don't we try to do what they did? And so we did. And we ended up interviewing Matt Lieber and Alex Bloomberg of Gimlet because they had done the same thing a few years prior and done it quite successfully. And talking to them about their experience. The other thing that happened is because we were tech journalists, we had gotten a grant offer from a nonprofit, or we had thought we did, and that was incentive for us to leave. And then that grant offer fell through.
No.
But we also then got another offer to work for a really fascinating and strange startup that was backed on cryptocurrency. And so the idea was that we were going to report on, try to explain cryptocurrency to the average person, and then participate in this experiment, which was meant to try and save journalism, both in like investigative journalism and local journalism. So we were one of the first podcasts out of that experiment to launch. And it was great. It was a really wild, completely insane couple of years of reporting.
That's a topic that I'm very passionate about, is how do you save journalism? Like, where does journalism go from here? I'd love to hear your perspective as somebody from the radio and broadcast media side. I was print. Do you have any thoughts? Do you have any ideas? Like, where can journalism go to help itself?
I don't know. I despair thinking about this, and I wish I had a better answer, but I just don't have it. We were really, really invested in that project working because it just seemed like a very good idea. I mean, there are nonprofits that are trying to kind of do the same thing that Civil was trying to do without the cryptocurrency aspect of it. And really, that's the reason it failed, is because they weren't able to create like a user-friendly experience for people, for normal people trying to support journalists.
Yeah.
But I think the best answer I can give is that it has to become a locally supported endeavor, and people just aren't used to supporting and consuming news that way. And journalism in general. I do think it's interesting because the public radio format has worked for so long, and it's really just nonprofit and membership based. So I think membership is going to be really important in the future. And then I think the big stalwarts like the Times and the Post and the major news organizations out there in addition to the public radio network, for me, is how I spread it out. I try to support my local journalists as much as possible, but then I rely on the big ones for the everyday truth telling that we need in this country.
Jen, over the course of your career, and especially diving into the executive producing of podcasting world, what's the thing that you've learned the most about either yourself or about creating shows or storytelling? What are your takeaways at up to this point?
I have learned that making good audio work and storytelling and journalism can take up 24 hours of your day if you let it. So over the past 6 or 7 years, I've been working really hard. And I see people that are coming up in the business that are doing this way better than I did when I first started. But I think I've learned boundaries a little bit more. I've learned that you can still tell a good story and get sleep and, protect your well-being, and that the stories will be there. And that if you end up working for a place that doesn't allow for those boundaries, that's probably not a good sign. But it's really hard to find too, because media is such a busy, competitive environment. But for me, I've started to experiment with can I succeed and still take care of myself? It's a really hard thing to do in this business.
Appropriate that you are at a company now like 10% Happier. I'm assuming that has fostered that belief, right?
Absolutely. It's definitely one of the reasons I'm there. It's not the only reason either. I do generally believe in the mission of mindfulness and meditation, and I have a daily meditation practice and a yoga practice as well. But there were long periods, and it's interesting because you do have to work your butt off in the early years to learn the craft, like we were talking about before, right? Experiment with storytelling, experiment with different formats, mess up, crash a live show, all those things. But eventually, once you've kind of honed those skills, then it's about, I think, collecting yourself a little bit more and giving yourself space. But yeah, 10% for sure is we're building a team. I'm in the process of hiring 6 producers right now.
Wow.
And they're from all different levels of producer. And it's interesting because the hiring process at 10% is very extensive. There's many rounds, and part of it is so that we can build the best team possible, most diverse and attract really high quality candidates from diverse backgrounds, and so many of the people that we're interviewing are looking for a place that can walk that line of working really, really hard, but also protecting each other's space and boundaries and health. And because you can't make stories about that sort of thing and then not respect people's boundaries at
right.
work. This is not fair.
A little bit hypocritical there, if that were to take place. This is just out of sheer curiosity. Is it, as a host, this would drive me nuts, so I'm interested in your perspective. Do you ever hear, you've been saying tape, used to be tape.
Yeah.
Do you ever hear an interview and just, or are listening back and just on the edge of your seat, I wish they would have asked that? Is that ever hard for you to not insert yourself into that world? Yeah. How do you deal with that? That would be super, super hard.
I think it's funny. I don't know. I don't know any producer that doesn't do that, or and hosts too. That I think it's funny because when I'm around people in the industry and we're listening to something, and I'll say exactly that. You didn't ask the key thing there, and you'll laugh, but there's only a finite amount of time, right? And I generally try to respect, and what I choose to listen to is generally very good content. So I respect what the hosts and the producers are doing. And if there's a major miss, then I, bang my fist on the table and walk away. But what are you going to do? Everyone has their approach, and it's all good for the most part. But I do it all the time. I can't help myself.
I can only imagine. Jen, what's a question that you wish you were asked more?
Oh, like like from producers or
just I'll let you take that wherever you want. Like what's a question you wish you were asked more?
That's such a good, I don't know. Let me think about that for a second. I think from people coming up in the industry, meaning people that are trying to figure out how to navigate and where they're going to go. I was working, I'll tell you a little story that'll preface this question, but I was working on The Takeaway many years ago and at WNYC. It was a daily news magazine show, national show. And I was working with Noelle King, and she's now one of the hosts of NPR Morning Edition. And she had a full-time job, and I didn't yet. I was still working as a per diem, and I turned to her and I said, I don't know what I have to do to get a full-time job here. And she turned to me and was like, you have to make yourself indispensable. And for some reason, like saying that, it just lit a light bulb in my head. And I did. I immediately started like booking guests in a different way. And like that bit of advice was so important from her. And I wish more people would come to me and say, essentially, like, what's the best approach for me to like move forward in this direction? Like, I think sometimes people want kind of vague advice, but asking like really directed advice on where to move next and how to do that can really change your life if you're open to it.
Fantastic stuff. Jen, thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it. How can people follow along with the work that you are involved in putting out?
Thank you so much. I'm very flattered to be on the show. They can follow me on Twitter. I'm just J Poyant. That's JPOYANT at J Poyant.
Fantastic. I'll make sure that is linked in the show notes. Jen, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. This has been great. And best wishes to you.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm happy to do it.
The advice Jen was giving there at the end, I know it was career related, but I gotta believe that there is a nugget of wisdom there in asking the question, where do I want this to go? And being more direct with that can have absolutely a carryover into our everyday lives and conversations. So reflect on that this week as well. And be sure to subscribe to The Follow-Up. It's my newsletter that comes out every Friday. You can sign up and subscribe on my website, thefollowupquestion.com/newsletter, where every Friday I expand my thoughts on a key theme or topic from the interview this week. So many thanks to Jen for sharing her story on the show this week. Please do me and Jen a huge favor. Share this episode with someone you know who might also find some value in listening to today's conversation. Share the episode with your network. Help spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions. And if you like the conversations with the amazing guests like Jen that I have on each week, be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. And subscribing also helps the show gain more reach. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com or go to thefollowupquestion.com and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question, and until then, keep asking questions.